Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israeli forces will remain in a Golan Heights buffer zone until border security between Israel and Syria is guaranteed. Israeli troops seized parts of the heights earlier this week, citing potential security threats from Syria. The Israeli military has been carrying out strikes in Syria against military targets, despite international condemnation.
This is the Israeli military in the UN-monitored demilitarised buffer zone between Syria and the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Israel has announced it would keep a limited number of troops there because the Syrian military had abandoned its posts. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said it was a temporary defensive position until a suitable arrangement is found. The buffer zone is known as the Area of Separation. It was set up as part of Israel's ceasefire agreement with Syria in 1974 to keep Israeli and Syrian forces apart after Israel's occupation of the Golan Heights. The move is part of a far-reaching Israeli response to the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. Their military has launched strikes on Syrian army facilities, weapons warehouses, airports and naval bases. But there's been condemnation of Israel's actions by many countries and by the United Nations.
There is absolutely no basis under international law to preventively or preemptively disarm a country you don't like. If that were the case, it would be a recipe for global chaos, because lots of countries have adversaries they would like to see without weapons.
Back in the Golan Heights buffer zone, it's unknown how long Israeli troops will remain as developments in Syria move at a rapid pace.
Fawaz Gerges is a Professor of Middle Eastern Politics and International Relations at the London School of Economics. Welcome to DW. Israeli troops are saying they've entered this buffer zone between Israel and Syria because of security concerns. Could you talk us through what they're worried about, what they're trying to do?
They grabbed new territories outside of the Golan Heights. Already Israel, for your own viewers, already occupies the Syrian Golan Heights, and according to the United Nations and most nations, it's illegal occupation. So what Israel has done in the past few days, given the vacuum in Syria, basically it has expanded its occupation of the Golan Heights for really strategic areas in the buffer zone. And this buffer zone is protected by the United Nations troops. According to the United Nations, according to many nations, including France and Germany, it's very illegal. Israel really basically acting unilaterally to grab more land, point one. Point two, Israel has carried out the largest air campaign against Syria in its history in the past few days. It has destroyed the entirety of the Syrian army infrastructure. Syria now has no army. Israel has launched 456 attacks in the past few days. Why this is very important? Point one, it's very important because it's illegal. Most of the world says it's illegal. Secondly, what Israel is doing now is complicating the process of transition inside Syria. It's really showing the opposition to be impotent and unable to defend their sovereignty. Thirdly, what Israel has done, it has really now created a security vacuum, because Syria now no longer really has an army to secure its borders. In the same way, when the Americans occupied Iraq in 2003, they dissolved the Iraqi army. And that particular decision came to haunt Iraq and the Americans for many years, as you well know, because Iraq did not have an army, and the various armed groups took action into their own hands. All in all, the question is not really whether Israel has violated the 1974 disagreement or peace agreement or ceasefire agreement with Syria. I doubt it very much whether Israeli forces will ever pull out of this buffer zone. Israel has a tendency historically to grab land and then stay temporarily and then stays permanently, as we have seen in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Lebanon and Syria as well.
So, Professor Gerges, Israel, of course, is saying it is doing this because of these security concerns. It's protecting itself. You're saying that it wants to grab more land. And if we could come on to this issue of how long Israel will be in the buffer zone, as you just mentioned, Israel is saying that it is temporary. But I just wanted to bring up this quote by the Israeli Prime Minister, where he said the Golan Heights will be part of the State of Israel for eternity. So from what you're saying and from according to that quote, do you think that Israel intends to be there for the long run?
Really very legitimate questions, and thank you for your questions. As a historian, I put a great deal of trust in history. If history serves as a guide, Israel, whenever it occupies something, whether in Palestinian lands or Syrian lands, or basically it never leaves, because it wants not only security, it wants absolute security. And as a professor of international relations, I can tell you, there is no absolute security. And the Golan Heights, the Prime Minister said, the Israeli Prime Minister, it will be part of Israel for eternity. Yet it's an occupied Syrian territories. Israel, along with the Trump administration, decided that basically Israel has the right to annex the Golan Heights. My take on it, I hope I am wrong, Israel keeps grabbing Palestinian land, Syrian lands, and now Lebanese land, and without really international pressure by the United States, I doubted very much whether Israel really will ever pull out of this buffer zone. Let's come back to Syria. Literally, what Israel has been doing, and the United Nations and other nations, including the United States, are impressing on Israel not to tax the new transitional authority in Syria. In the eyes of the Syrians now, the new authority really is impotent, is really powerless to protect the nation. And this complicates an already complicated situation in Syria. So you don't really have to take my words or the Israeli Prime Minister words. You need to take the reality, the international community response, including Germany and France and many other nations, about what Israel has been doing. Not only is illegal, it's really pouring gasoline on a raging fire in Syria.
Israel is saying, Professor Gerges, that it's worried, of course, that Syria could allow Iran to re-establish itself in Syria, that it might permit arms transfers to Hezbollah, or even that it fears that Syria could attack Israel. With all of these concerns that Israel's putting forward, how do you see relations between Israel and the new Syrian government developing?
The authorities, the opposition authorities, are desperate not to take any position against Israel. In fact, the opposition, including the Islamists, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, have never lifted a finger to support the Palestinians in Gaza, have never allowed a protest in their areas under control in Idlib in support of the Palestinians. They have gone out of their way to try not to really confront Israel. As to the new authorities allowing Iran to establish bases in Syria, the opposition forces are viscerally anti-Iran. If you tell me what's the overarching aim of the oppositions, 100% is anti-Iranian, anti-Hezbollah, anti-Russian. Israel does not really have any security concern given after the fall of Assad, because you have a new authority, and historically since 2012, Israel has had relations, informal relations, with some of the opposition factors. In fact, many of the injured opposition combatants were lifted to Israel and were treated in Israeli hospitals. Let's call it by what it is. Israel is using this moment of vacuum in Israel to grab more Syrian land and to basically destroy the military infrastructure in Syria. My fear, if Israel keeps doing what it's doing, is going to turn not only the Syrian people, but even the new authority against it. They're creating new enemies as a result of their really expansionist and aggressive and muscular policies toward the opposition now.
Professor Fawaz Gerges from the London School of Economics, thank you so much for your time today. Let's get more from DW's Stella Männer, who joins us from Damascus in Syria. Stella, there are reports about new strikes near Damascus. What can you tell us?
Earlier on, I was in the city center of Damascus, and we could loudly hear the explosion of the airstrike that was in the suburbs of Damascus. Until now, we don't have any further information about what was the target or if anyone was injured. I spoke to people here in the city, what they think about the situation and how they feel about it. The many people here, and the most given answer was that people feel like they are used to Israel striking Syria and also Damascus, and that this has happened already before the fall of Assad. They also told me that they're a little bit more worried about what's happening at the moment at the Golan Heights, and that they're worried that Israel is now going to use the moment to occupy more land and actually to move further into the country.
Stella, can you give us a sense about how things are in Damascus? Are things starting to normalise in some ways now? What does it feel like?
Yes, very much. We have a feeling that life goes back to normal. I'm standing here at Souk Kashkul, and you can clearly see behind me that it is very busy. The shops are opening, and they will stay open because there's no curfew anymore. Also, the currency is stabilizing more and more. A couple of days ago, for $1, you would get 30,000 pounds. Today, it is only 14,000. And we can also see that some shop owners here are repainting their shops, as they had the old regime flag painted on the doors and the walls of their shops, and they're now repainting to add the green stripe instead of the red stripe of the new flag.
DW's Stella Männer reporting from Damascus. Thank you so much, Stella. And we're joined now by Marc Weller, a professor of international law and international constitutional studies at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Welcome to DW. Thank you for your time today. Can I ask you, does Israel's seizure of the UN buffer zone, does this violate international law?
Yes, the essence of a buffer zone is that it's meant to be free from the exercise of control of either side, to move significant military forces into it, and even to start to establish some fortifications, is of course inconsistent with that regime that has been in place for some 50 years now. On the other hand, Israel has occasionally just gone around or through UN-monitored buffer zones, like very recently in Lebanon and several times before that. This does not augur well for the credibility of such zones. For instance, if Ukraine were to consider to establish something like that, and therefore it is somewhat concerning that it has taken some time for the international community to protest against this conduct.
We were just hearing from our correspondent there about airstrikes in Syria, Israeli airstrikes. Can Israel legally justify airstrikes in Syria under claims of self-defense and security concerns?
Self-defense is meant to be a response to an armed attack. Israel has not been subjected to an armed attack by Syria. In rare occasion, it is permissible to strike first if the other side is just about to launch an imminent armed attack. You don't have to wait until the attack lands. But here, what we're looking at is a kind of 19th century or even Clausewitzian view of preventative war. There's the sense that this is a good moment to knock out much of Syria's military potential because it cannot respond really to any attack, and that might be useful to Israel at some point in the future. This is far too remote a threat to Israel as that it could give rise to a justification of self-defense.
The UN has accused Israel of breaching the 1974 disengagement agreement. How does this impact, again, Israel's legal standing?
Yes, I think it adds to a general sense that Israel has, as it has announced, decided to kind of change the Middle East in the image of its own security interests, and is not always mindful of international law when doing so. And I think this will be seen as a further step. Remember that Israel is, in view of the international community, most of the international community, already unlawfully occupying the Golan Heights, which Syria claims is its own territory. And to extend this now further into the buffer zone is quite a significant escalation and perhaps a provocation to any subsequent Syrian government. Mm-hmm. Therefore, there are some risks that this will have destabilizing consequences in the future, hence the American demand, and America has generally supported Israel, hence the American demand that this incursion must remain strictly temporary.
Mm-hmm. Are there any legal precedents that exist regarding cross-border military actions without UN Security Council approval?
Yes, and in fact, the key precedent is one that once again involves Israel. In the early 1980s, Israel attacked a nuclear power installation that was being constructed in Iraq. It argued that this installation would in due time be capable of constituting a major threat to Israel, producing fissile material, and therefore that this was a good moment to knock it out before it had come on stream. On that occasion, the Security Council, which normally cannot act against Israel due to the US veto, condemned this action and even demanded that Israel would have had to pay compensation for the reconstruction of that installation, something Israel obviously did not do.
Mm-hmm. Marc Weller, Professor of International Law and International Constitutional Studies at the University of Cambridge. I'd like to thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
DW correspondent Emily Gordine is in Jerusalem. Emily, tell us more about these reports of new Israeli strikes on Syria. What can you tell us?
Well, the Israeli side hasn't really commented on these recent strikes that have appeared to have been carried out around Damascus again. But essentially, this very much falls in line with what the Israeli strategy has been since the Assad regime fell. Israel essentially is pursuing two goals here. One is to protect its citizens and its territory from possible spillover effects, possible attacks that could arise from the turmoil that's currently still sweeping Syria. And B, number two, its goal is also to make sure that, as we just heard in the report, to make sure that that Assad's weapons arsenal that reportedly still remains in Syria, it's information we can't confirm from here, but ultimately that these weapons don't fall into the wrong hands. Oh, and sorry, I wanted to continue there. Of course, you know, like we just had in that report, to pursue this strategy, obviously, we've seen Israel carry out aerial strikes on Syria's naval bases, but also this push into the buffer zone. That's not only been into the buffer zone, but also beyond that. And Netanyahu's condition essentially is to have a situation that on the other side that will guarantee the safety of Israel, but nobody knows how long that will take. So ultimately, this as much as the Israeli side is saying that this is temporary, it is also, in a way, indefinite. And of course, this has not been without criticism. We also, in the report, heard from the UN envoy to Syria, Geir Pedersen, but we've also been hearing criticism from Turkey, where the foreign minister came out saying that, quote, Israel is again displaying its occupy mentality. So harsh criticism there, but so far it seems that's been falling on deaf ears.
And Emily, how do people in Israel, how do they feel or how do they see Israel's actions in Syria?
Well, in Israel, people are watching what's going on in Syria with mixed feelings. On the one hand, the fall of Assad is in Israel's interest in the sense that it takes out Syria from Iran's so-called axis of resistance. It cuts off this lifeline that Hezbollah needs from Iran. But at the same time, it also comes with a lot of uncertainty. And so from the people that I've spoken with, many do see the measures that the Israeli army has taken as necessary and sensible precautionary measures.
DW correspondent Emily Gordine in Jerusalem. Emily, thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by Harel Chorev. He's a Middle East analyst at the Moshe Dayan Center in Tel Aviv. Harel, it's good to have you back on the program. The previously demilitarized buffer zone between Israel and Syria, established back in 1974, it's guarded, protected by the UN, an observer force. Are we clear on why Israel decided to breach that zone?
Well, it's mainly in the northern part of the Golan Heights. Indeed, formally, it's along the Golan Heights, as you showed, but in fact, the forces are in a certain part in the northern part of it. It's an area with 5 villages. Some of them are Jews, which are protected by Israel, and not for the first time. It was a few years ago when Israel was required to protect them and to prevent measures against them. But that's not the main reason. It's one of the 2 main reasons. The other reason is that Israel wants to see how the current regime, which is still crystallizing, as we know, will act. Because at the end of the day, we have nobody can blame us, for being afraid of people on white trucks, jihadists. That we would like to take some precautions. We need to make it clear we're talking about a strip of something in between 3 to 5 kilometers. It's not the 10% that Turkey, for example, occupied out of Syria's territory. And as Israel said, and I really hope this is the plan, it will withdraw once it will know that everything is under control.
Well, there are 2 messages coming out of this. Let me ask you if you agree. One is Israel wants to be proactive to protect itself. And the second is that it does not want to, leave its national security in the hands of a UN force. Am I reading that correctly?
I think you're reading it correctly. In fact, during the battles before Assad was toppled down, Israel was required to protect the UN base in El-Khader village. So it was Israel protecting the UN and not vice versa. The whole situation is very volatile, very combustible. And this is exactly why the IDF has changed the positions within those limited areas. And hopefully, personally, I can tell you, we have nothing to do there if the regime will be stable and will not threaten Israel, obviously.
Do you believe or think that Benjamin Netanyahu is also of that opinion, that this is purely about protecting ourselves? This is not about an opportunity of perhaps expanding territory.
No, the area there is very harsh. It's very hard. It's a very exceptional area, I would say, in regard to the rest of the Golan Heights. And there's not in territorial terms, Israel has nothing to do there. There are already 5 villages there. And what Israel is doing currently is basically digging a trench, an anti-tank trench, to defend this particular area. In other areas, it's much easier to defend them, even from within the Golan Heights, the Israeli Golan Heights. In this particular area, it's a historically more vulnerable area where we saw tanks invading the land in Yom Kippur War. So there are particular measures being taken there. I don't see the expanding over the tactical need.
The U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said today that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seems to be prepared to negotiate a deal for the release of hostages held in Gaza, and that a ceasefire seems to be something that is now more realistic. That was his reading. Do you share that?
I do, actually. I'm not sure that Hamas is ready. Just yesterday, we've got some negative voices from Lebanon, from one of Hamas representatives there, who said things that are contradictory to what we've understood in recent days regarding Hamas' willingness to go forward. So we're holding our fingers, so to speak. I'll tell you what is in the mind of the Prime Minister. Currently, Israel is enjoying operational freedom in the Gaza Strip. Actually, there's nothing that the IDF cannot do within hours within the Strip. So this, of course, obviously allows the IDF a much more freedom in decision-making, including to withdraw and to get in again if that's what it will, if we will need to do that, if they will do, any provocation that is needed. I think this install a lot of confidence in the Prime Minister's mind. And hopefully, as I said, we're holding our fingers.
All right. Harel, it's good talking with you. We appreciate your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Brand.